I've just absolutely fallen in love with fretless guitar in a very short amount of time. And, that could just be the honeymoon phase. Just got everything all dressed up, last night, and it's been about a day. After maybe a month of leaving it kind of there, maybe half, the setup was like halfway there. It was playable, but not like really good. So it's a little soon. It's a little soon to be getting maybe this enthralled about it, but I'm telling you, if you're a guitarist and you don't own a fretless guitar, you should really think about it. I'm just absolutely blown away. It's like a 10-year-old kid getting a video game for his birthday that he's been waiting all year for, and he's just super excited about it. And then when he gets it, dopamine receptors just going absolutely crazy, like a pinball in a pinball machine, and then he's just... That's how much fun this is. So I'm going to show you the whole process. So you're going to see how I did the conversion, how I did the setup, everything. And I'm going to give you all the specifications, which you can check the description box for because I always include that there as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. First is removing the frets. My secret weapon here is an old pair of Channel Lock 357 end nippers with the jaws ground flush to a near razor edge. My good friend and guitar tech mentor first made these in the early 70s on a bench grinder. He made me a pair, and then later, when I got more experience, I made my own pair on a belt sander. The key is getting them down to a near razor edge, so the jaws will be thin enough to slip under the bead of the fret and act as a wedge as you close the jaws together and walk the fret out of the slot. The extra wide jaws are superior in every conceivable way to the smaller jaws you'll find on commercial fret pullers. I haven't run into a single fret yet that these were unable to pull. They also act as their own chip stopper due to the large surface area. The flush surface of the jaws will press chips back down if they start to come up. Next is the board preparation. In this case, a compound radius, as that's what I prefer on all my necks. Check out my video, which I've linked to in the description box, about how to create a compound radius and even how to calculate for the correct compound radius for a given fingerboard. I go pretty in-depth in that video, and it would be redundant to recap the process here. Once the radius has been established, the slot preparation is next. I'm using a StewMac fret slotting saw with a 23 thousandths blade and a depth stop. I'm going to be gluing veneer into the fret slots, and I need to make sure the slots are all cut to a uniform depth to accommodate the veneer. It's the same concept when installing actual frets and cutting the slots to make sure they're deep enough to accommodate the fret tangs. You can just use the slotting saw by itself, but for added assurance that it won't accidentally go crooked, you can use a radius block on the fingerboard as a fence. The side of the saw will butt up against the radius block and ensure that it won't cut accidentally at an angle, only perfectly straight. This is also an opportunity to cut the slots deeper on the ends for greater visibility. This can be desirable if you want to fill the fret slots with a completely contrasting color, like white plastic or maple fillers on an ebony or rosewood board, and want to be able to see the ends while you play. Every other time I've done this job, I've used plastic binding strips and superglue. I'd either load the slot with glue first, then press the binding strip in, or press the binding strip in first, and then wick thin superglue into it from both sides. However, superglue can be a pain to clean up, so I got to thinking, why not hot hide glue and wood veneer? I have this beautiful brass glue pot from Music Caravan that I bought probably 10 years ago that I've only used a handful of times, and I have plenty of dried hide glue granules. So I decided to mix some up and use it for this job. It's very straightforward once the slots are cut to depth. Just cut a length of appropriately sized veneer, in this case 21 thousandths thick, which is about 2 thousandths under the size of the slot, then load the slot with glue and press the veneer in. I place it by hand, then tamp it down with a cut popsicle stick. One major advantage of hide glue is the miraculously easy cleanup. Unfortunately, I got a bit impatient here and ended up wiping off the fresh glue with a damp paper towel. Still very simple, but if you allow the glue to gel or dry before cleaning it up, it'll either peel or flake off with nothing but a little scrape of a fingernail and leave no trace that it was ever there. The fast drying time is another advantage, and the only reason it didn't dry as fast here is I added a little salt to the mixture to extend the open time, a little under 3% of the dry glue weight. I was worried I might not have enough time to press the veneer in otherwise, but in hindsight, it not only would have been fine, but would have made the process go even faster and easier. Once the glue is dried, I use the same end nippers I used to pull the frets to clip the veneer as flush to the fingerboard as possible. I do this on the top of the fingerboard as well as on the ends on the side of the neck. Micro chisels work very well for trimming off any excess on the top of the fingerboard, and a hand file can be used to get any leftover veneer flush with the side of the fingerboard. Keep in mind that there's still a final leveling process to do that will smooth everything out even more and get it playing as perfectly as possible. What I'm talking about is understring leveling. I always use understring leveling, whether I'm leveling a fretboard or fret tops, to get the most accurate results possible. Understring leveling accounts for any changes in the profile of the board or the fret tops that might occur when the neck is straight under string tension compared to when the neck is straight without string tension. You'd be surprised to learn that there can actually be a significant difference between the two. As Davide Bisoli says in his patent numbered JP 2011-248314A, titled Tool for Straightening Frets, Fretboards, or Fingerboards while strings of stringed instrument are kept mounted, the conventional method for adjusting frets, fretboards, or fingerboards of a stringed instrument that includes removing strings or releasing the tension of the strings and then grinding frets is not perfect and causes balance to be lost once the strings are mounted again. Check the description box for more information and a link to Davide's business website, rectifymaster.com, where the original patented understring leveling tools can be ordered. I'm not affiliated with Davide or Rectify Master in any way, and this is not something I'm being paid a single penny to say. It's merely a shout out to a fellow inventor who deserves full credit for his contribution to the world of lutherie and stringed instrument setup and repair. Shifting gears back to the fretless guitar, there's one more thing to do. After the understring leveling is done, the final step is purely cosmetic. Dyeing the rosewood fingerboard black and installing white plastic binding strips around the 12th fret marker. First, I'll wipe down the board with paint thinner to get rid of any dust, dirt, or grime that might interfere with the dye's ability to penetrate the wood. For the dye, I'm using Fibing's Black Pro dye. I've heard Minwax True Black is potentially even better, but I've never tried it. I applied it with a Q-tip, being especially careful around the inlays. Fibing's dye will absolutely stain inlays, and even if you don't apply it directly over the inlay, an excess of dye can wick into the wood and get into the inlay from penetrating into the wood grain beneath it. An artist's brush is probably more appropriate, but I managed okay with the Q-tip. Again, just remember to avoid getting it on the inlays. And if you do get some on an inlay, a pencil eraser can help, and then aggressively rubbing the inlay down with paint thinner on a Q-tip. After the initial coat of dye, it's important to clean the board with paint thinner. This will pick up excess dye that's on top of the wood but didn't penetrate into it. If you don't clean this off, it'll end up on your fingertips when you play. Using a Q-tip may be tedious, but it's the best way to go if you have inlays, as wiping the excess dye off without avoiding the inlays can stain them. Here I got a bit lazy and just used paint thinner on a balled-up paper towel rather carelessly between the inlays. Then I wiped the whole board down indiscriminately. This resulted in some light staining of the inlays, and I ended up re-leveling the board to get rid of this and doing it again the right way. I repeated this process several times, applying the dye, wiping it down with paint thinner, applying another coat of dye, and wiping it down again. I then installed the cream binding strips. I waited until after staining the board to install the binding, as I didn't want to stain the binding black by accident. Hide glue worked just as well for the plastic binding as it did for the wood veneer, and I trimmed them down exactly the same way with the end nippers and micro chisel. I thought having a contrasting color on the two binding strips surrounding the 12th fret would be a nice touch, and I also think there's something to the idea that fretboard slot markers can hurt more than they help when it comes to accurate intonation. There's that, and then the fact that to me it just looks really cool and really unique. There's one last thing to mention here. Since I've already leveled the entire board and the plastic binding strips aren't going to be finished leveled that way, I used a small hand file to get them flush with the fingerboard. And I do mean a small hand file. This is a piece of a Nicholson file that I cut off with an angle grinder. I keep an assortment of very small file pieces like this one around the shop. You really never know when they'll come in handy. I'll wipe any hide glue remnants away with a very lightly damp paper towel, and then I'll proceed to the final step. Smoothing out and then coating the fretboard. For smoothing, I'm just using a Scotch-Brite pad and then a piece of polishing cloth. The goal here is just to get the board feeling slicker. Unfinished wood is plenty slick, but the sandpaper used for leveling, unless it's done to a fine grit, will leave a lot to be desired. When I'm done giving it the once-over, I'll coat it with a thin layer of Renaissance wax. I put a small amount on a folded paper towel and rub down the entire fingerboard in a circular motion. It just takes a couple passes up and down to get the wax onto the board, then a few passes with a dry paper towel to buff it off. The fretless conversion and fretboard preparation are done, but I promised earlier in the video to go over the setup details. The setup process is the same as it would be for any other stringed instrument, and since going over a full guitar setup would take way too much time for this video, I'll simply share the final setup specifications that you see right now on the screen. Then I'm going to focus on only two aspects of the setup that are especially critical for fretless instruments: the profiling of the top of the nut and the depth of the nut slots. There are two reasons for this. The first is intonation. Nut slots that are too high will require a greater distance to be traveled between the string and the fingerboard, effectively bending the string and raising the pitch. This is equally true on fretted instruments, but intonation issues are even more noticeable on a fretless. The second reason is to enable smooth, seamless fretting of the microtonal notes between the end of the nut and the beginning of the first fret position. The bass strings should be sticking out a little bit over the top of the nut, the treble strings should only be a little bit below the surface of the nut, and the slots should be cut low enough so you can slide up smoothly right from the end of the nut. Remember that there's no string bending on fretless instruments, so you can get away with a much shallower nut height than you'd be able to on a fretted instrument. No string bending means no lateral force that can pop the strings out of shallow nut slots. To reduce the height of the top of the nut, I use a sharpened pencil that I've flattened the bottom of on a belt sander. It lays flat on the fingerboard and traces the radius onto the nut, and I use that pencil line as a guide when taking the material down. I always use a spindle sander for speed, but then I refine everything in the StewMac nut and saddle vise with a hand file. I'll test it on the guitar several times between filing, and when I'm finally happy with the profile of the top of the nut, I'll wet sand it down with 400 grit sandpaper, then wet sand with 1200 or 1500 grit paper, then polish it with some Novus 2 plastic polish or Meguiar's Plast X on a Q-tip. These are both excellent products, and I regularly recommend Meguiar's line of rubbing, polishing, and waxing and sealing compounds for general guitar work, maintenance, and finish repair as a premium choice. The last thing I'll mention is that I initially strung this guitar up with round wounds and found that I vastly prefer flat wounds. I made a custom set using single gauges of Tomastic Infeld flat wounds with the gauges I showed during the setup specifications part of this video around the 10-minute and 38-second mark. The feel and tone of these strings is phenomenal, and I can personally vouch for the Tomastic Infeld brand. However, whatever brand you choose, I'd highly recommend trying both round wound and flat wound strings to see what you prefer. It's especially worth noting that I'm using a wound G string. You might prefer a plain steel G string. Give both a try. I've tuned this guitar a whole step down and then tuned it to open G from there for a final tuning of C, F, C, F, A, C. And just because I know somebody's going to ask, yes, the humbuckers are custom made by yours truly. Pickups aren't the topic of this video, so I'll just share a few pictures of the specifications, which include the parts and magnet wire gauge I used to build them, along with the turn count, DC resistance, inductance, capacitance, and Bodie plot. I really wanted a clear sound for this guitar, especially on the neck pickup, and the Alnico pole pieces really go a long way in delivering that. Check the description box for a link to my playlist titled Pickup Building, Rewinding, Testing and Repair for more complete information on pickup tone and much more. The wiring is standard Telecaster wiring with a 3-way switch, a master volume, and a master tone with a .047 tone cap. With all of the fine details out of the way, load the nut back into the slot, string it up, set it up, and we're finally done. I am so excited that I can finally just stop working on it, sit down, and enjoy it. Don't get me wrong, I've enjoyed everything about this whole process, from doing the fretless conversion job to the hours upon hours spent with my camera to capture the whole process step by step. But there's nothing like enjoying the fruits of your labor, and this is the end goal of all guitar work. To have an instrument that you can simply get lost in for hours upon hours without having any idea how much time has gone by.